We are incredibly fortunate at Union to have tremendous minds and significant talent, but in a particular sense, we are blessed, if you will, by the visionary leadership of our president, the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones, who is the 16th president of the Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. She's the first woman to head up our now 180-year-old institution. She occupies the Johnston Family Chair for Religion and Democracy. Along with her overall leadership of our institution, she's formed a Union's Institute for Women, Religion, and Globalization, as well as the Institute for Art, Religion, and Social Justice, among many other initiatives. We are thankful that she will now take the time to share from her perspective an understanding of the state of the Union of Faith, the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones.
Hello, everyone. Please feel free, since we're not taking a break because we're short on time, to get up, come get coffee, find the restroom, stretch your legs. And I'm going to be also brief today, following those quite remarkable reflections on faith. What I want to do is to bring another set of framing issues to the table as we sort through this question of how religious belief and practice relates to how we formulate policy and think about politics. And today I'm going to talk to you wearing two different hats. This year I am, in addition to being the President of Union, the President of the American Academy of Religion, which is a collection of about 12,000 scholars who, for the most part, approach the study of religion as an object to be studied, to be analyzed, data to be given, and to histories to be told and texts to be analyzed. It's a deeply multi-faith, pluralistic organization, and I'm going to be sharing with you some of the statistics that come out of the work of that organization, but also bring them into conversation as I wear the hat of the President of Union, where I am part of a community, where I'm a theologian, I'm a minister, I'm a person of faith, and I'm someone who is helping cultivate a context in which faith commitments and commitments of conscience can be nurtured and formed in the next generation of spiritual leaders in this country. What I want to do very quickly is draw you 5 different maps that try to answer the question, what is the state of the union of faith? And the most basic answer to that question is, it is a mess. The nicer way to put it is, it's in a state of flux. And as I'll return at the end of my reflections to, I believe that we are right now in the middle of a massive global cultural revolution that looks somewhat like what happened 500 years ago in the Reformation, when the processes of cultural meaning-making at a massive level were so shifted because of new technologies and new configurations of state that a new understanding of religion emerged. So I'll return to this theme, but I want to give you some background to it. So the first map I want to talk to you about, map number 1, is the check the box of religion map. What do we look like globally as the world's major religions? So here's just some basic numbers. There are 2.3 billion Christians in the world, 1.7 Muslims, and just to pause here, 5 years ago there were 2.1 billion Christians and 1.5 billion Muslims. It gives you a sense of how quickly these numbers are growing. There's 1.6 people who are put into the category of unaffiliated, which, as it's unpacked demographically, includes everyone from the person who says I'm secular, to the person who says I'm atheist or agnostic, to the person who says I'm theist, but I'm not affiliated with any kind of specific religious community, traditionally called in the United States the nones, the no religious affiliation. That is the third largest group globally right now in terms of how one situates oneself in relation to religion, and there are 1.6 billion people who fall into that category, only slightly behind Islam. There's about 1 billion Hindus and about 1 billion Muslims. And then after this category, we get into a number of smaller religions that fall below the 500 million mark, and not to dismiss them. But today what I want to focus on are these 5 major categories that constitute the vast majority of the world's population. Islam is growing the fastest, and at a policy level, it is very clear in the United States we need to increasingly think globally. But we know so little about Islam because proportionally it has such a small place in terms of the demographics of religion in the United States that it impacts how we think about foreign policy. We think it's important to know the GDP of every country in the Middle East. We think it's important now to study the impact of climate change of all the countries in Southeast Asia. And yet, I dare to say that most members of Congress do not know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite Muslim. And how is that possible, given that it is the mobilization of those faith communities around their religious beliefs that will have direct impact on how GDP is formed and how climate change is addressed? So it's interesting, in the terms of this first map, and I'm going to be drawing tensions for you, the globe has never been more religious. It has also never been more secular. So interesting tension there. So second, I want to go to a map that goes beyond the check the box of religion and looks within the categories that I've just laid out, and talks about the diversity that exists interior to this. And this is where you begin to see the massive fluxes that are taking place. Christianity is primarily based in the southern hemisphere. And Christianity is quickly becoming more Pentecostal than it is either Roman Catholic or Protestant. In the U.S., there is an even decline taking place between Protestants, Roman Catholics, and interestingly enough, in the last 5 years, evangelicals as well. It's a myth that the evangelical community is growing by leaps and bounds. In fact, the decline is consistent with mainline Protestant decline, except the one place where we see a growth in Christianity in the United States is among Latino Roman Catholics and Pentecostals. In the global context for thinking about Islam, there are also significant shifts taking place. We're seeing in places like Iran and Egypt not only the growth of some forms of religious extremism, but a very outspoken reclaiming of a secular Islam that was there quite strongly in the past. I recently had the chance to visit Iran last June, and in that process of uncovering the history of that nation religiously, discovered that at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, 80% of the people of Iran described themselves as secular Democrats, albeit Shiites. Now, as to what happened to that history in the Middle East, it's a longer discussion about U.S. foreign policy and what we have done to undermine rather than support growing democracies. But like Christianity, the growth of extremism within Islam has, in many of the demographics, been so foregrounded that we often forget when we talk about Islam to include vast stretches of Southeast Asia where you find the predominance of Islam, which itself is part of this growing democratic move within Islam itself. And then I want to talk about internal to these categories, the unaffiliated. As I said earlier, the unaffiliated, this 1.6 billion people who check the box that doesn't fall into one of the world's major religions, are mostly theists. These are people who claim to believe in something greater than nothing. I think only 11% would categorize themselves as either agnostic or atheist. But what's also included in this category, and it's an interesting phenomena that I think we're going to see more and more of as we move forward, is the category of double belonging. If you just take the United States itself, there's now about 16% of the population that, when asked to identify themselves religiously, would check the box unaffiliated because they see themselves as part of two religious traditions. This happens sometimes because they marry across religious boundaries. A Christian will marry a Muslim, but even more significantly, people find themselves standing in one tradition, but on a daily basis engaging in the practices of another. And you see this most predominantly in the U.S. With respect to the rise of Christians and Jews who practice Buddhist practices in terms of meditation and mindfulness. So we call this double belonging, but what does that mean to how we think about religious identity in general? So you can't make a judgment about a specific policy, position, or orientation if you just look at religion at the level of the check the box category. You have to begin to drill down to see what within those religions the diversities of perspectives in terms of communities create. So, third map I want to talk about is what do people in these different groups, both the big ones and the internal ones, actually believe and practice at the level of everyday life? What do they know about their own, quote, religion? Well, let's just begin to look at some of the data. Christians in the United States, the vast majority, I think the last number was something like 72%, of Christians in the United States cannot give you a theological reason for why they belong to a particular church. The two reasons that are given is the charisma of the pastor and the friendliness of the community. But if you were to ask someone why they're at a Methodist church and not a Church of Christ, that reality even exists as a reality that is significant for reflection upon, has ceased to be a main framing feature of Christianity in the United States. In the U.S., most Muslims do not read the Quran. They do perform prayers and they fast, but reading the Quran is not a part of their daily practice. Most Buddhists in the United States, the vast majority, do not meditate regularly. And the list goes on. When it comes to this large group, the unaffiliated, there's no set of practices that seems to mark them, except they are better than any other single group in telling you what they do not believe. So why they have taken the position of being unaffiliated. And this goes back, I think, to what many of our members discussed as the reasons having to do from everything from piety and arrogance to a lack of fit between comportment and belief that have driven, in the United States, the unaffiliated out of mainline and conservative Christian and Jewish communities. So, map 4. So we've looked at the place that belief and practice actually plays in religion today, alive as it stands on our streets in this country and globally. Map 4, what does this show us across the board about what things all of these different communities might share? I've been talking about the difference. Well, there's 3 things that stand out remarkably. One is that in all of these religious traditions, there is a belief, it's fundamental to religion itself, and you find it even in the non-affiliated category, a belief that we are part of a bigger story. May take the form of metaphysics, may take the form of a notion of God, may take simply the notion of being a part of a unified whole. There are many ways of naming this. The second theme that seems to run across all of these categories is the recognition that we are, as human beings, interconnected, and somehow in that interconnectedness responsible for each other. In Christianity, that takes the form of this basic claim that we are called to love our neighbors. And thirdly, running through these religious traditions, is a sense that when one loves one neighbor, one is called particularly to love and be present to those who suffer. those who are the least of these. So having said these three framing comments about what seems to be shared across all of these categories, when you begin to actually parse what they mean, there is very little agreement on, if we start with love thy neighbor as thyself, who one's neighbor actually is. How does one define the neighbor? Of course, you look on the current political scene in the United States, and the reach of accounts of who's in and outside of that category, from a universalist account, which says every single living human being is my neighbor, and extended even to animals and to plants and to rocks, and in fact, to all features of the universe itself on this end, to my neighbor is confined to those who quite literally live in the way that they look and believe and situate themselves in the world closest to me. And all others exist in the category of enemy. Secondly, there's very little agreement on not just neighbor, but what it means to love them. Now, love here is a profoundly political concept, because love defines the character of how we embody that interconnectedness. Using the word love in this context to describe the range of political disagreement across political parties is an interesting way to think about it, because you can, in fact, find on the farthest right, most extreme position in this country, love being used as an argument to justify very oppressive and restrictive and exclusionary practices and policies. But there is no more political term than the term love, because love defines what is the character and the tissue and therefore the nature of our public life together. All right, I'm going to get to a really interesting fifth map here, and then I'm going to conclude. This week we had Catherine Hayhoe, who is an evangelical woman who is also a climatologist and has taken on the evangelical community on the issue of climate change, because as many of you are well aware, the vast majority of the climate deniers in this country claim to be evangelicals. So Catherine Hayhoe has been looking at the data on politics and religious affiliation. And a poll done 6 months ago showed that currently in the United States, party affiliation, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, is more determinative than religion with respect to how you choose your marriage partner. And that has never before been the case in the United States. It's actually kind of startling. The biggest indicators of how you choose your marriage partner previously had been religious, community, and race. Party affiliation has now moved to the top of the list. What this means for how we think about religion is very interesting, because what constitutes party affiliation in this same study shows that we have moved to a moment in history in which your party identity is an all-in or nothing identity category. So if I am going to be a Republican, I am going to check the box on all of these issues straight down, and it's a box that is self-contained. Similar dynamic in terms of identifying oneself as a Democrat. But what this means then is that with the all-in or nothing category, that then religious beliefs as the second determinative factor come in, and you can show this demographically, as a sort of second matter justification for the all-in party affiliation. Party affiliation, not religion, no matter how much we want to say we're a religious country, is presently determinative of our view of government, and that there's very little theology taking place within the world of policy discussions, albeit religion is invoked constantly. What you'll find in most churches today, both on the right and the left, are pastors who, when they want to talk about public life, talk about policies, but do not talk theologically. So you put all of this together, you begin to see that in the United States right now, we are a deeply divided country politically, manifests itself in terms of our religious orientation, and it also manifests itself in the increasing vacuousness of our capacity for moral discourse and moral orientation. And this is as true for Trump supporters as it is for Black Lives Matters. So here I'll end by just giving you a few reflections. So what does this mean? What do these overlapping maps mean for a conversation here? For how reflective people of faith and reflective people of conscience move forward. In this kind of climate, it's easy to simply move into a state of despair. Now, this is not, I'm not just making a plug for Union Theological Seminary, but when I look at what is driving the students at Union Theological Seminary, the students who are going to seminary around the country, as well as what I see in the millennial generation in my trip to Iran. In January, I was in Cuba, meeting with seminary students in the millennial generation there, going in 3 weeks to India. As you begin to see what's happening with respect to millennials who take the moral question seriously and who are willing to engage in reflection and participation in spiritual practice, you're finding an interesting emergence of a spirituality that I find quite hopeful. It has three features to it, and you see this across the board in terms of this moment in history. It is increasingly interfaith, and it's not just double belonging. It's interfaith in the sense that one knows and understands and appreciates, indeed lives in the context of faith traditions other than one's own. Secondly, there is a deep commitment to learning the wisdom of also at the same time a single tradition. A tradition within which you situate your own practices, albeit in the context of conversation. And then thirdly, a deep commitment to social justice, to addressing the ills that plague us. I think globally we are at a turning point. I'll end on this. I could go on about this for hours, but Representative Johnson began to talk about this, that globally when it comes to religion and therefore, when it comes to politics, we are clearly at a turning point where as religion grows, it is manifesting itself on the one hand in increased forms of tribalism and extremism, languages that shut down rather than open up, but at the same time, it is manifesting itself in communities that are increasingly open, interfaith, committed to social justice, and willing to consider true engagement across the lines of difference that even 20 years ago would have been unimaginable. So what direction we take with respect to how we maneuver the territory of religion and politics, I think is absolutely crucial. We're in the midst, I would say it's not that we are looking forward to a revolution of values, a period of moral transformation. We are actually in the middle of that. And it's all going to pivot on how that little word love gets read and enacted in the context of our religious lives as it's manifested in the world of our political affiliations. So thank you.
We thank President Jones for helping to further lay the groundwork for both discussion now and hopefully ongoing reflection on these issues as they weave themselves into the narrative politically, socially, and otherwise.